Hello, friends and staff of the Kent Northwest Kidney Center, the finest dialysis unit in the Western world. My production manager recently informed me that my in-services were missing a theme song, and so I hope you enjoy the background music as I introduce you to today's topic, blood transfusions. This is an amazing service which we are fortunate enough to be able to provide at our dialysis unit. We'll start with a discussion of the history of blood transfusions and then focus on potential complications that might occur as we give blood transfusions to our dialysis patients. This is the sixth in-service I've done online over as many months, and the number of likes I have received has steadily declined over this period. Last month's quality in-service on vitamins received only 1 like on the YouTube platform. And I'll confess that I was a person who liked the video. I at least expected Corey and Amy to like the video since they specialize in nutrition, but obviously I need to lower my expectations. On the plus side, no one clicked on the dislike button on the YouTube platform, which is good. Okay, so enough of the theme song. Let's get to the in-service. It all began about 400 years ago. As you know, many of you who've listened to my previous in-service are aware that I'm quite fond of the history of medicine. So let's spend some time discussing how transfusions became a therapeutic reality. In the year 1628, when the English physician William Harvey became the first to accurately describe the circulatory system, he specifically recognized that the heart pumps blood around the body. Now, physicians had previously thought that the lungs pump blood to the tissue, where the blood dissipates and does not return back to the lungs. They also thought that the function of the heart was to generate heat rather than to pump blood. So, understanding circulation and the fact that blood is passed continuously throughout our vascular system was an exciting breakthrough and generated considerable interest in studying blood itself. The first blood transfusion was performed by a man named Richard Lauer. He was a physician and member of the Royal Society in London. He studied blood circulation. He traced the circulation of blood as it passed through the lungs and learned that it changes when exposed to air. So specifically, he was the first to observe the differences in venous and arterial blood, specifically the oxygenation of blood, which is an amazing and important observation. So Dr. Lauer performed the first transfusion in 1666 using dogs. So he strapped the dogs down on a table. He allowed blood to flow from the carotid artery of the donor dog, he called it the emittent donor, into a vein in the recipient's neck, while the recipient's own blood ran out of its carotid artery. The transfusion came to an end when the emittent dog, the donor dog, began to, quote, cry and faint and fall into convulsions and at last die. The recipient dog, however, did well, and Lauer published the results in 1666 in the Philosophical Transactions, the world's oldest scientific journal. And the transfusion experiment generated great scientific interest among the Royal Society in London, particularly among a scientist named Robert Boyle. Now, Robert Boyle was a philosopher, a chemist, a physicist, inventor. He is largely regarded today as the first modern chemist. He was also a member of the Royal Society in London, and he raised interesting philosophical questions about blood transfusion. He speculated that the composition of blood really defines the nature of the organism. And he thought that the transfusion of blood could transform biological creatures in a process called transmutation. In other words, he and other scientists speculated that our blood makes us who we are. It defines our personality, what we know, and what we do. All this is stored in our blood, and that this nature could be passed from one organism to another through blood transfusion. This idea was not unique to Boyle. Other physicians and scientists believe this as well. For example, a man named Samuel Pepys, who was an administrator in the English Navy and also a member of the Royal Society, described at one of the Royal Society meetings a story of an old man who, oddly enough, only drank breast milk as his sole source of nutrition. Sort of a definition of a dirty old man, I suppose, but that's a subject for a different talk. So apparently, the milk was observed to affect his temperament. When he received it from an angry, fretful woman, he became angry and fretful. When he received milk from a good-natured woman who was patient, he was happy and good-natured. So Pepys and other scientists believe that bodily fluids such as blood and breast milk define our spirit and nature. And again, that the characteristics of one person could be transmitted to another through blood and other bodily fluids. So back to Boyle. The premise of many of Boyle's questions was that blood transfusion might induce physical, mental, and psychological changes in an animal receiving blood. So regarding the recent dog-to-dog transfusion, he asked the following questions. Does transfusion change a dog from one breed into another? That is, if you give the blood of a golden retriever to a Rottweiler, will the Rottweiler turn into a golden retriever? Does a transfusion alter a dog's temperament? In other words, can a fierce dog be turned into a cowardly dog? If you transfuse blood from a dog that's just been fed into a hungry dog, will the hungry dog still be hungry? Can you change a dog's memory? For example, if a dog has been taught to fetch and carry, could those learned behaviors be obliterated by repeated transfusions from untrained dogs? And will a dog with new blood still know its master? Of course, with our current understanding of circulation and blood transfusions, we know the answers to these questions, and frankly, we think that these questions are silly. But back then, these were legitimate and scientific questions. So, following Lauer's experiments, researchers were eager to leap forward to try transfusing blood into a human subject. From dog experiments, they knew that draining blood from the donor animal usually killed the dog, and so they thought that a human-to-human transfusion was not safe. So they decided that they would use a sheep to be the source of blood for the Royal Society's first transfusion into a human subject. Now, the choice of a human recipient was more difficult. The Royal Society needed someone who was clearly unwell in some way, someone who might improve their overall physical or mental health as a consequence of a transfusion. They also sought an educated person who could report reliably on the transfusion's effects on his body. And ultimately, they settled on a man named Arthur Koga, who had, quote, a harmless form of insanity, end quote. So he's mentally unstable, but he was also educated. He knew Latin, and he had spent some time as a clergyman. Specifically, they hoped that Koga's mental illness might be cured by transfusion. They suggested that the blood from a gentle lamb might quiet the tempestuous spirit of an agitated person. So, on November 23rd, 1667, the members of the Royal Society of London gathered in their meeting hall to observe the experiment performed by Dr. Richard Lauer and another doctor named Dr. Edmund King. Blood started flowing from the sheep into Arthur Koga. The scientists watched, and they waited for the transformation of Mr. Koga, and waited, and they waited, and then nothing happened. They had expected him to get up on all fours and start baaing like a sheep, but he didn't do that. There was no change in his personality, and surprisingly, he tolerated the transfusion well from a physical standpoint. Koga was paid 20 shillings, the equivalent of $225 in US dollars, to participate in the experiment, which he then promptly spent at a local pub on alcohol. A few days after the transfusion, Pepys, the administrator in the Navy, met Koga at a dinner party, and he found Koga spoke very reasonably and very well, though he was cracked a little in his head. The research on transfusion was soon stymied by public mockery. People realized the experiment didn't work, and Koga went off and drank a lot of alcohol and was considered to be an unreliable subject. And the subject soon became featured in a popular play called The Virtuoso, which had made fun of the sheep-to-human blood transfusion. And fellows of the society who saw the play were deeply mortified and embarrassed. Then a few months later in France, a similar experiment was done, but this time the recipient, the person who received the blood, died following the procedure. And it was later found out that he most likely died of arsenic poisoning. That is, he was murdered by other physicians in Paris who were opposed to the transfusion and wanted to sabotage the experiment. Anyway, because of this and the public mockery of the London Royal Society, blood transfusion research came to a halt for the next couple of hundred of years. So the next big development in transfusion medicine occurred in the 1800s. It was a British obstetrician by the name of James Blundell, and he proposed that a transfusion would be appropriate to treat severe postpartum hemorrhage. He conducted a series of experiments in animals and observed that as long as the blood was transfused quickly, a transfusion could be successfully performed even with just a syringe after it had been collected into a container. He also discovered the importance of letting all the air out of the syringe prior to infusion into the recipient so that you don't cause an air embolism in the recipient. So in 1818, he performed the first successful transfusion of human blood to treat a postpartum hemorrhage. And he used the patient's husband as a donor and extracted 4 ounces of blood from the arm, transfused it into the wife, and she did well. So fortunately, they had the same blood type. And then during the years 1825 to 1830, Blundell performed 10 transfusions, 5 of which were beneficial, and he published his results. And he also invented a number of instruments for the transfusion of blood. Then in 1840, there was an English surgeon by the name of Samuel Armstrong Lane, who at St. George's Hospital Medical School in London, aided by Blundell, performed the first successful whole blood transfusion into a patient who had hemophilia, which is a bleeding disorder. Still, early transfusions were considered risky. Many resulted in the death of the patient. And so by the end of the 19th century, blood transfusion was really considered risky, sort of a dubious procedure, and was largely shunned by the medical establishment. That all changed, however, by the work of Karl Landsteiner. He was an Austrian biologist and physician, and in 1900 he discovered the main blood groups, so A, B, O, and of course AB, making human transfusion much safer. Interestingly, in 1938 he discovered rhesus factor, which is a protein on the surface of red blood cells. It's either present or it's absent, therefore either positive or negative, and that's why we say O negative blood or O positive blood. So Karl Landsteiner is basically considered the father of transfusion medicine, and as an aside, he also discovered the polio virus in 1909, so amazing man. And here's a fun fact that you can share at your next trivia party. Veterinarians also administer transfusions to animals, and they need to be tested to ensure a compatible match. Cats have 3 known blood types, cattle have 11, dogs 13, pigs have 16, and horses have 34 different blood types. Okay, now Landsteiner discovered that bad things would happen if you mixed blood from 2 incompatible individuals. If you mix blood that was incompatible, it would trigger an immune response, and then the red blood cells would clump. And this immunologic reaction occurs when the recipient of the blood transfusion has antibodies against the donor blood cells. And that leads to the destruction of red blood cells, which releases free hemoglobin into the bloodstream, which can have fatal consequences, including kidney failure. Landsteiner's work made it possible to determine blood group and allowed blood transfusions to take place much more safely. And very deservedly, he won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine in 1930. Okay, so transfusion medicine developed very quickly after this. There was a Russian physician and philosopher, Alexander Bogdanov, who founded an academic institution devoted to the science of blood transfusion in 1925. Now, he was motivated in part by his search for eternal youth. And he himself, through experimentation, had received 11 transfusions of whole blood, and he was very pleased with what he perceived as to be subsequent improvement in eyesight, suspension and balding, and general overall improvement in his health. Unfortunately, in 1928, he received a blood transfusion from a student suffering from malaria and tuberculosis, and he died as a consequence of those infections. Okay. Um, um, the first transfusions had to be made very quickly from donor to receiver because the blood would clot. It was subsequently discovered that the addition of an anticoagulant would make it possible, along with refrigeration, to allow for blood to sit for several days before it was actually infused. And the most common anticoagulant used is citrate, which, by the way, is also used as an anticoagulant in dialysis. Okay, World War I acted as a catalyst for the rapid development of blood banks and transfusion techniques. The Secretary of the British Cross, Percy Oliver, established the world's first blood donor service in 1921. Basically, it organized a system of voluntary registration of blood donors around London. The volunteers had their blood tested to establish the type. The London Blood Transfusion Service was free of charge, and in 1925 it became incorporated in the British Red Cross. And then similar systems were developed elsewhere in England, as well as around the world: France, Germany, Austria, Belgium, United States, etc. Okay, now I'd like to shift gears and talk about potential complications of blood transfusions. These include transfusion reactions, hyperkalemia, citrate toxicity, and infection. So there are several different types of transfusion reactions. They include acute transfusion reactions, febrile non-hemolytic reactions, hemolytic transfusion reactions, allergic or anaphylactic reactions, transfusion-related acute lung injury, and transfusion-associated circulatory overload. In general, when someone has a transfusion reaction, you want to stop the transfusion, save the remaining bag and tubing for potential analysis. You want to confirm that the correct product was being transfused, because clerical mistakes sometimes happen. And of course, you want to assess the patient. Do they have a fever? Are they breathing okay? Do they have chest pain, back pain, itching? Are they having swelling of their throat or angioedema, etc.? Okay, so an acute hemolytic transfusion reaction is a life-threatening reaction caused by acute intravascular hemolysis, or literally the explosion, the bursting of red blood cells in the blood vessels. And that's due to a blood type incompatibility. Most often this occurs because of a clerical error, improper ABO blood typing, and cross-matching, resulting in an ABO mismatch between the donor and the recipient. People have fever, chills, flank pain. They start to bleed from their intravenous sites. Management, of course, is to stop transfusion. And if this were to happen in a dialysis unit, of course, we would call 911 and send them to the ER. There's something called transfusion-related acute lung injury, or TRALI. This is a life-threatening form of acute lung injury. It occurs when the recipient neutrophils become activated by the transfused blood in the pulmonary vasculature, so basically in the blood vessels in the lung. It's a relatively common transfusion reaction, despite being historically underreported. People present with fever, chills, and trouble breathing, so respiratory distress. And the management basically is supportive, and it can be so bad that people require intubation, mechanical ventilation. The donor then needs to be identified and would be barred from donating again, because there's something in the donor's blood that is activating, causing a significant activation of the recipient's immune system. Okay, the next complication that can occur is TACO, so transfusion-associated circulatory overload. This is a common problem, and it's basically pulmonary edema due to volume excess or circulatory overload because there is quite a bit of volume associated with blood transfusion. So it typically occurs in patients who receive either a large volume of a transfused product for a short period of time, or those with underlying cardiovascular disease, or of course in dialysis patients who are very sensitive to volume overload. The treatment is supportive oxygen, fluid removal on dialysis. So this is a common problem, one of the many reasons why it's optimal to give blood transfusions on dialysis so that we don't cause volume overload as a consequence. Okay, anaphylactic transfusion reaction is basically any allergic reaction other than hives. It's fairly rare and it presents with shortness of breath, wheezing, often with low blood pressure, and it's due to an allergy of something in the blood product. It can be a protein in the donor, it can be any number of things. Basically, we take this very seriously. We would call 911. The medics might administer epinephrine, antihistamines, and usually take them to the emergency room. Okay, urticarial transfusion reaction. This is also very common. People present with hives, but no other allergic findings. So no wheezing, no angioedema, no hypotension. And the most common cause is an antigen-antibody interaction that occurs between the patient and the product. So in other words, usually the recipient has a reaction to a donor's serum protein. Important to know that if they develop hives, this is not a contraindication to continuing the transfusion as long as there are no other allergic symptoms. We would give them Benadryl. Okay, febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction. Basically, this is defined as fever and chills in the absence of other systemic symptoms during a blood transfusion. The most common cause, we think, is a release of cytokines from white blood cells in a blood product that hasn't been what we call leukoreduced. So leukoreduced blood is blood from which the white blood cells have been removed prior to transfusion. Most often we give leukoreduced blood to our patients, but if that procedure hadn't been done, there are donor white blood cells in there, and they can trigger fever. Treatment is supportive, acetaminophen, and just because they have a fever, you don't need to stop the transfusion, it can be continued. Okay, primary hypotensive reactions. These are characterized by a drop in blood pressure without other causes of hypotension. The classic definition is a decrease in blood pressure by 30 millimeters of mercury or more with the onset of transfusion. The blood pressure quickly returns to baseline if the transfusion is stopped, and it can occur independently from other transfusion reactions. So, for example, the acute hemolytic reaction or transfusion-related acute lung injury or anaphylaxis. Okay, hyperkalemia. So this is very important to recognize as a dialysis provider. Blood contains a lot of potassium. And the longer that blood sits in a refrigerator, the more likely the red blood cells are going to release the potassium from their cytoplasm. This is one of the many reasons why we prefer to give blood transfusions with dialysis than apart from it, because we can cause clinically significant hyperkalemia with a blood transfusion. Okay, citrate toxicity. So whole blood is collected using a balanced citrate solution, and that citrate binds to calcium. Calcium is important in the clotting cascade. So if you don't have enough calcium, you can't clot blood. It's an uncommon problem. Basically, you have to give someone a lot of citrate, and if they have a lot of citrate in their blood, then you can lower the free calcium in the recipient's blood, and that can cause symptoms of hypocalcemia. Basically, muscle twitching, tingling around the mouth, etc., etc. Okay, there are several infections that can be transmitted by blood, though pretty much all of them are uncommon. Hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, CMV, West Nile virus, there are a number of protozoan parasitic infections, malaria. Of course, we don't have that here, but we do have a parasite in the Pacific Northwest called Babesia, and that can cause a disease called babesiosis, which causes basically hemolytic anemia. In South America, they have a protozoan parasite named called Chagas, and that can do the same. And then finally, you can get bacterial infections. Syphilis can be in the bloodstream usually a month after the primary infection. So that would be bad timing to donate blood if you just had syphilis. And then, of course, it could be bacteria on the skin if the skin of the donor when the blood was collected. Okay, now the risk of infection is very, very low because the blood bank does an exceptional job in screening for infection. The risk of hepatitis B is less than 1 in 1.2 million transfusions. The risk of hepatitis C is less than 1 in 20 million transfusions. The risk of HIV is less than 1 in 7 million transfusions. And the risk is so low because of the use of a highly sensitive nucleic acid testing for these infections. Just an aside, you can order CMV negative blood. Essentially, CMV, a very common infection. At least half the population has been exposed to CMV, and it can be transmitted in the white blood cells from the donor. So you can either leukoreduce blood or you can give them blood that is CMV antibody negative, suggesting that the donor has not previously been exposed to CMV. And this is particularly important for, say, pregnant women or recipients of stem cell transplants or, immunosuppressed patients like kidney transplant patients. Okay, it's time for your quiz. True or false? If you transfuse sheep blood into a human, the human will act like a sheep. Okay, very good. It's false. Next one. This medical discovery by Carl Landsteiner made blood transfusion much safer. Very good. Blood groups. So he identified in 1900 blood groups A, B, O, and AB. And that way, you could make sure that the donor and the recipients were matched by blood type, made transfusion much safer. Okay, this chemical is the most often used as an anticoagulant in blood products. You got it, citrate. So we do use citrate as an anticoagulant in dialysis too. You may have heard of citrate dialysis. We also sometimes give citrate as a catheter lock if someone is allergic to heparin. Okay, name 3 types of transfusion reactions. Okay, very good. Acute transfusion reaction, febrile and non-hemolytic reactions, hemolytic transfusion reactions, allergic or anaphylactic reactions, transfusion-related acute lung injury, and transfusion-associated circulatory overload. Okay, last question. What is the risk of acquiring HIV from a blood transfusion? Very good. Less than 1 in 7 million transfusions. Okay, so this concludes the August 2020 in-service on blood transfusions. I hope you found it helpful, particularly when you next participate in administering a blood transfusion to one of our patients. Thank you for watching these in-services, and thank you for choosing not to dislike this video on the YouTube platform. Until next month, enjoy the rest of your summer.